The wind howled through the gray morning, making the waves churn with an unsettling fury. Jack Malone, a seasoned fisherman from the small coastal village of Harborview, pulled his cap down over his forehead and squinted against the cold mist spreading over the sea. He had spent his entire life facing these treacherous waters, but nothing could have prepared him for what was about to happen. He just wanted one more peaceful day at sea, but he never imagined that a single choice would change his fate forever. Before we continue, if you love inspiring stories, make sure to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you don't miss anything. And tell me in the comments, have you ever witnessed or lived through a moment when life suddenly took an unexpected turn? Jack had always been a simple man. His boat, the Seabreeze, wasn't new anymore, but it was all he needed to make a living. Ever since his father passed away, he had taken on the responsibility of supporting his family, braving storms and daily struggles just to put food on the table. But the last few weeks had been tough. Fish prices had dropped and the bills were piling up. Every day, the weight of worry on his shoulders seemed heavier. That morning, he cast his nets, hoping for a good catch. But as he scanned the horizon, something caught his eye. A strange movement, far away, between the waves. At first, it looked like just a piece of wood drifting in the current. But then, his eyes widened. That wasn't a piece of wood. It was a man. Without hesitation, Jack fired up the boat's engine and sped toward the spot where the body was struggling against the force of the sea. Every second mattered. His heart pounded in his chest. Who was this man? How had he ended up there? Jack knew the ocean showed no mercy. If he wasn't fast, it would be too late. What Jack didn't know was that saving this man would change his life in a way he could never have imagined. Jack tightened his grip on the helm of the Seabreeze, steering the boat with precision through the churning waves. His heart pounded as he got closer to the drifting man. The sea was relentless, tossing the small boat back and forth, but he couldn't give up. The stranger was fighting against the current, but his movements were slowing. Time was running out. "Hang on!" Jack shouted, his voice barely cutting through the howling wind. The man, soaked and exhausted, tried to lift a hand, but the ocean's force was dragging him under. Jack knew he had to act fast. He grabbed the rescue rope he always kept on board, tied it securely, and without a second thought, threw it toward the stranger. "Grab it," he ordered. For a moment, the man seemed too weak to react. His wide eyes were filled with terror, his face as pale as the foam of the waves. Jack felt a knot tighten in his stomach. He had seen that look before, people surrendering to the sea, giving up the fight. But he wasn't about to let that happen. "Not today," Jack growled, leaning forward. "Take the damn rope, now!" As if those words had sparked something inside him, the man mustered the last of his strength and clutched the rope. Jack pulled with everything he had, feeling the dead weight of the man resisting the pull of the current. His entire body strained, muscles burning from the effort. The boat rocked dangerously, but he refused to let go. Little by little, he managed to drag the man closer until he finally reached out and grabbed him by the arm, hauling him onto the deck. The stranger collapsed, coughing violently as seawater poured from his lungs. Jack dropped to his knees beside him, checking his breathing. He was alive. Weak, but alive. "You okay?" Jack asked, still catching his breath. The man didn't answer right away. He just lay there on his back, trying to regain his strength as the rain started to fall lightly. His eyes were fixed on the cloudy sky, as if trying to make sense of what had just happened. After a few moments, he turned his head and looked directly at Jack. "Thank you," he murmured, his voice hoarse. Jack nodded, relieved. But as he took a closer look at the stranger, something about him seemed off. His face wasn't ordinary. There was something refined about his features, something that didn't fit with a lost tourist. But right then, Jack didn't care. All he knew was that he had saved a life, and that was all that mattered. What Jack didn't know yet was that this man was no ordinary tourist. The boat's rocking eased as Jack slowed the engine, giving the rescued man a chance to catch his breath. The storm seemed to be fading little by little, but the wind still carried a biting chill, making the stranger shiver uncontrollably. Without a word, Jack grabbed an old blanket he always kept on the boat and tossed it over the man's shoulders. "Wrap yourself up. It'll help you warm up," Jack said, turning his attention back to the helm. The man accepted the blanket with a weak nod. His face was still pale, his lips tinged blue from the cold. He remained silent for a while, watching Jack steer the boat toward the shore. Gratitude was written all over his face, but there was something else too. Something restless, unsettled. Jack, on the other hand, was a man of few words. He had seen plenty out at sea, but pulling someone from a shipwreck always carried a mix of relief and tension. Who was this guy? How had he ended up out there? What happened? Jack finally asked, breaking the silence. The man ran a hand through his wet hair, trying to gather his thoughts. I was on a boat ride. Wanted to get a closer look at the ocean. His voice was still rough but steadier now. The current flipped the dinghy and threw me far out. I tried swimming back, but the waves were too strong. Jack studied him for a moment. He didn't look like a fisherman or someone used to the sea. His clothes, now drenched and disheveled, were high quality. A fancy watch still clung to his wrist, though water had likely ruined it. This guy definitely wasn't just another tourist. "Were you alone?" Jack asked, keeping his eyes on the horizon. The man hesitated for a brief moment before answering. "Yeah, I just needed some time to think. I made a mistake." Jack nodded, but his skepticism lingered. He'd met plenty of people passing through that village, tourists coming and going, businessmen mesmerized by the ocean view before heading back to their big city lives, never truly understanding what it was like to live here. This guy didn't seem any different, but something about him didn't quite add up. "What's your name?" Jack asked, glancing at the stranger. The man looked at him for a second before answering. "Richard. Richard Sullivan." Jack frowned. The name rang a bell, but he couldn't quite place it. "Jack Malone," he replied simply, turning his attention back to the helm. "And next time, Richard, you might want to stay on dry land." Richard let out a weak, humorless chuckle. "Yeah, maybe you're right." Jack didn't reply. He just kept steering the boat as the village of Harborview began to appear on the horizon. But deep down, something told him this encounter wasn't just a coincidence, and he was about to find out why. The sea breeze glided slowly over the now calmer waters, approaching the small Harborview dock. Jack stole a quick glance at Richard, who was still shivering from the cold, but seemed more composed. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable. It was as if they were both processing the last few hours. When they finally docked, Jack climbed out first and tied the boat to the worn wooden pier, weathered by time and salt. The scent of fresh fish mingled with the salty sea breeze, and around them, a few fishermen began to gather, curious about the unfamiliar face. "Jack!" a familiar voice called out. It was Tom, an old friend and the owner of the local fish market. "What happened?" "Who's this guy?" Jack sighed, already expecting the questions. In a small town like this, news spread faster than wildfire. "Found him out at sea," Jack said, gesturing toward Richard. "The current nearly took him." Tom let out a low whistle, shaking his head. "You're lucky, buddy. The sea around here doesn't usually give second chances." Richard stepped off the boat, struggling slightly as his legs still felt weak. He looked around, taking in the village, the narrow streets, the colorful wooden houses, the almost surreal calmness of the place. It was a stark contrast to the world he came from. "Where can I find a phone?" Richard asked, stuffing his hands into his soaked pockets. Jack wiped his hands on an old rag and nodded toward a small cafe at the end of the street. "Over there at Marianne's. She's got a landline." Richard gave a nod and started toward the cafe, but then he paused for a moment. "Jack," he hesitated. "Thank you." "Really?" Jack shrugged. "I just did what anyone would do." Richard let out a small smile. "No, not everyone would." Jack didn't respond. He just watched as Richard walked away, disappearing down the cobblestone street. Something inside him told him this wouldn't be the last time he saw that man. Tom crossed his arms and looked at Jack with a half-smile. "You know who he is?" Jack frowned. "A tourist who almost drowned?" Tom let out a short laugh. "He's a lot more than that. Richard Sullivan. That guy is one of the biggest investors in the region. He's got stakes in hotels, resorts, and rumor has it he's thinking about buying land around here." Jack remained silent. Suddenly, everything made sense. The expensive watch, the high-end clothes, the way he had studied the village with that calculated gaze. Richard Sullivan wasn't just a lost tourist. He was someone who could change the lives of many people here, including Jack's, and the fisherman had no idea how that was going to happen. Jack was still standing on the pier, processing Tom's words. Richard Sullivan. Now the name made sense. He wasn't just another visitor passing through. He was a powerful man, someone who could change the future of this fishing village. But the real question was, would that be a good thing or a bad thing? The day carried on. Jack went back to his routine, cleaning the boat, organizing his nets, selling the day's catch to Tom's fish market. But in the back of his mind, that unease lingered. It was late afternoon when Jack heard footsteps approaching the dock. He looked up and saw Richard, now dressed in dry clothes, a light blue dress shirt and dark jeans. It was as if all the vulnerability of the man who had nearly drowned had vanished, replaced by someone who was used to being in control. "You came back," Jack said, wiping his hands on a rag. Richard gave a faint smile. "Let's just say I couldn't leave without talking to you again." Jack raised an eyebrow, but didn't respond. He just waited. Richard leaned against the edge of the boat, gazing at the horizon for a moment, before turning his serious gaze back to Jack. "I owe you my life. If it weren't for your courage and quick thinking, I'd be dead right now." Jack shrugged. "Like I said before, I just did what needed to be done." Richard shook his head. "No, Jack, most people would have hesitated. You didn't. That says a lot about you." Jack crossed his arms, wary. "And what exactly does that mean?" Richard took a deep breath, as if carefully choosing his words. "I'm a businessman, Jack. But today, for the first time in a long time, I realized there are things money can't buy. My life, for example. And you. You saved me without expecting anything in return. That doesn't happen often in the world I come from." Jack held his gaze steady. "If you're looking to pay me for the rescue, forget it. That's not why I did it." Richard let out a short laugh. "I figured you'd say that. But that's not what I'm offering." Jack narrowed his eyes. "Then what is it?" Richard ran a hand through his hair, thinking carefully before he spoke. "I've spent years investing in big projects, luxury hotels, multi-million-dollar resorts. But today, after almost dying at sea, I realized I might have been investing in the wrong things. What I want to know is, if I decided to invest in this village, in the people here, in fishermen like you, what would you say?" Jack felt a tightness form in his chest. He knew these kinds of speeches all too well. Promises of progress, of improvement, that in the end usually meant only one thing: big investors getting richer while the working people lost their roots. "That depends," he answered cautiously. "Are you talking about helping the village or turning it into just another one of your high-end resorts for rich tourists?" Richard chuckled, shaking his head. "You know, I like you, Jack. You don't sugarcoat things, and that's exactly what I need. Someone honest, someone who knows this place and can help me build something that actually matters." Jack didn't know what to say. He had spent his life out at sea, far from business deals and grand proposals. But now, standing in front of him was an opportunity that could change everything. The question was, could he trust Richard Sullivan? And more importantly, was he ready for this kind of change? Jack remained silent, feeling the weight of Richard's words hang in the air like a storm about to break. The offer sounded tempting, but at the same time, it carried risks he couldn't ignore. He knew his village, his community. Small investments could be helpful, but big changes often came with a price too high to pay. He rested his calloused hands on the edge of the boat, staring out at the sea, as if the waves might bring him an answer. "You say you want to invest in the village," Jack finally said, his eyes still fixed on the horizon. "But tell me, Richard, what exactly does that mean? New houses, hotels, fancy restaurants? Because if that's the case, soon the cost of living here will skyrocket. The families who rely on fishing won't be able to afford rent, and small businesses will be swallowed up by bigger ones. This village might thrive, sure, but the people who made it what it is today, they'll be the ones forced out." Richard crossed his arms, seeming to carefully consider Jack's words. For the first time, maybe, he was seeing things from a different perspective. "I understand your concern," he said sincerely. "But that's not what I'm talking about. I don't want to turn Harborview into something it's not. I want to find a way to improve people's lives here, without destroying what makes this place special." Jack let out a short, humorless laugh. "And you really think that's possible? That a man like you, Someone used to turning small towns into multi-million-dollar tourist hotspots can just put money in the right places without everything spinning out of control? Richard sighed, running a hand through his hair. For the first time since the rescue, he looked vulnerable, as if he was trying to figure himself out. "I don't know, Jack," he admitted, "but I want to try, and I need someone to help me do it the right way." Jack narrowed his eyes. "And why me?" Richard gave him a small, knowing smile. "Because you saved me without expecting anything in return. That tells me everything I need to know about you." The fisherman took a deep breath. He didn't trust big investors. He had seen too many of them pass through the village with empty promises. But Richard was different, or at least he seemed to be. And one thing was certain. This might be the only chance to secure a better future for his village without it being swallowed by reckless development. Jack studied Richard for a moment, searching for any trace of insincerity in his eyes. "If I say yes, I want something in return," he said firmly. Richard raised an eyebrow. "And what's that?" Jack turned fully toward him, his expression resolute. "Control. If you really want to help this place, then I want to be involved in every decision. I want to make sure no family loses their home, that no fisherman is forced out. If we do this, we do it the right way, or we don't do it at all." Richard studied him for a moment, then smiled. "Fair enough." He extended his hand toward Jack, waiting for a handshake. Jack hesitated for a second, then gripped it firmly, sealing an agreement that, somehow, felt bigger than the both of them. Jack felt the weight of Richard's handshake as if he were sealing a fate he couldn't yet fully see. He knew that accepting this proposal meant more than just overseeing an investment. It meant stepping into a world he didn't know, where money and power dictated the rules. And above all, it meant risking everything he had ever known. That night, as he sat at the table in his small wooden house, Jack stared at his simple plate of grilled fish and rice, but his mind was elsewhere. He thought about the village, about his family, about the fishermen who relied on tradition and the tides to survive. Would he be the one responsible for opening the door to something that could change everything irreversibly? He sighed, running his hands through his hair. Then he heard a knock at the door. When he opened it, he found Tom, his old friend, with a curious expression on his face. "So, are you going to tell me what the hell is going on?" Tom asked, crossing his arms. Jack stepped aside, letting him in, then sat back down as Tom pulled out a chair. "Richard wants to invest in the village," Jack said, getting straight to the point. Tom let out a low whistle, shaking his head. "And you said yes?" Jack hesitated before answering. "Yeah, but with conditions. He's not turning this place into a paradise for rich tourists. I'll make sure of that." Tom let out a short, skeptical laugh. "Man, have you ever seen what happens when guys like him set their sights on a place like this? First, it's small investments, a little grocery store here, a cozy inn there. But before we even realize it, everything we know is gone. What makes you think you can control that?" Jack leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table, meeting Tom's gaze with seriousness. "Because I won't step aside. I told him that if he wants to do something here, it's going to be on my terms." And he agreed. Tom shook his head, still unconvinced. "And you believe that?" Jack took a deep breath. "I don't know, but I'd rather be in the middle of it, with a chance to protect this village, than just stand by and watch everything change without anyone being able to stop it." Tom was silent for a while before letting out a long sigh. "You've always been stubborn, Jack. I just hope this time it works in your favor." Jack gave a small smile. "Me too." The next morning, Jack met with Richard again, this time at Marianne's small cafe. The businessman looked more composed now, with a notepad in front of him and a steaming cup of coffee in his hands. "So, Jack," Richard began, setting his cup down on the table, "if we're going to do this together, I need you to tell me where to start." Jack took a deep breath. He had never been involved in anything like this before. But if there was one thing he did know, it was what the village really needed. "Start with the fishermen," he said firmly. "A lot of boats here are old. They need repairs. If you really want to help them work better, fish more efficiently without having to overexploit the sea. If you do that, they'll trust you. And if you earn their trust, maybe this village won't just see you as another rich guy trying to buy what he can't have." Richard studied him for a moment, before breaking into a smile. "I like the way you think, Jack. Let's do this the right way. But Jack knew that words were easy. The real test lay in what came next, and he was about to find out that keeping his promise would be harder than he had imagined. In the days that followed, Jack and Richard began putting the plan into action. Richard kept his word, investing in new equipment for the local fishermen, ensuring that old boats could be repaired and better nets were provided. Slowly, the village's initial skepticism began to give way to cautious hope. But not everyone welcomed Richard's arrival with open arms. That afternoon, as Jack adjusted the ropes on his boat, a group of fishermen approached. Among them was Ethan, a broad-shouldered man with sharp features, one of the most respected figures in the village. "So, this is it, Jack?" Ethan said, crossing his arms. "You're bringing in some rich guy to decide the future of our village?" Jack wasn't surprised. He knew this conversation would come sooner or later. "He's not deciding anything on his own, Ethan," Jack replied, keeping his voice calm. "I'm making sure everything is done the right way." Ethan let out a dry, humorless chuckle. "The right way? Do you really believe that?" "Man, we've seen this story before. Promises of help, money starts flowing in, and before we know it, our village isn't ours anymore. Do you really trust this Richard guy?" Jack took a deep breath. "I don't trust promises, Ethan. I trust actions, and so far he's done exactly what he said he would." Another fisherman, an older man named Carl, slowly nodded. "The new boats really helped," he murmured. "And the fishing nets. We can't deny we needed them." Ethan scoffed. "Yeah, and for now, everything's fine. But what about later? What happens when he wants something in return?" "Because, my friend, people like him never do anything without a bigger goal in mind." Jack looked around. Many fishermen had gathered, watching the conversation with cautious expressions. He needed to choose his words carefully. "I know you're all skeptical," he said firmly, "and I get it. But think about it. How many opportunities like this have we had before? How many times has someone actually wanted to invest in this village without turning it into a resort for tourists?" Ethan remained silent, but his hard stare didn't waver. "The difference this time," Jack continued, "is that I'm here, and I won't let this village lose itself. But if you think I'm making a mistake, speak up now, because if we're going to fight for this place, we need to do it together." There was a moment of silence. Then, finally, Carl stepped forward. "I'm in," he said. "But we're keeping an eye on things, Jack. If this starts getting out of hand, you owe us an explanation." Jack nodded. "Deal." Ethan sighed, running a hand through his thick beard. "You've always been stubborn, Jack. I just hope this time it's worth it." With that, the group began to disperse. Jack watched as Ethan walked away, still skeptical. He knew he hadn't convinced everyone. Not yet, but for now, it was a start. What Jack didn't know was that the first real challenge was just around the corner. The following days were filled with hard work. Richard kept his word, funding boat repairs and investing in the village's basic infrastructure without changing its essence. Slowly, even the most doubtful villagers began to admit that, for the first time, someone with money seemed genuinely interested in their well-being. But then, just as Jack had feared, came the first big test. That morning, he was walking through the village market when he heard murmurs coming from the central square. Fishermen, shopkeepers, and villagers were gathered around a bulletin board where a large notice had been pinned. Jack stepped closer, and his stomach twisted as he read the bold letters. "New development proposal. Construction of a commercial pier and tourist marina to boost the local economy." Jack felt his blood boil. This wasn't part of the deal. He turned and spotted Richard standing nearby, engaged in a lively conversation with a group of businessmen. Jack pushed through the crowd and planted himself in front of him. "What the hell is this?" he demanded, wasting no time. For a moment, Richard looked surprised, but he quickly regained his composure. "Jack, I was going to talk to you about this." He gestured toward the businessmen beside him. "This is a huge opportunity for the village. A commercial pier would bring more tourists, and the marina would help boost the local economy." Jack crossed his arms, his expression cold. "And what about the fishermen? Where do they fit into this equation? You know damn well that a tourist pier will drive up rent, make everything more expensive, and in the end, push out the people who have lived here for generations." Richard sighed. I understand your concerns, Jack, but we need to think about the future. Tourism could be a huge source of income for everyone. We're not trying to replace the fishermen, but to diversify opportunities. This doesn't have to be a bad thing. The crowd around them murmured. Some looked interested, others clearly uneasy. Ethan, watching everything with his arms crossed, let out a dry, ironic chuckle. I warned you, he said, staring at Jack. So now, what are you going to do? Jack felt the weight of everyone's expectations pressing down on him. He knew Richard wasn't the villain here, but he also knew that if he allowed this, the village might never be the same again. He looked at Richard with unwavering determination. If you want to do this, you're going to have to prove to me that we're not just selling our village to tourist money. And I want the fishermen to have a say in this decision. Richard hesitated for a moment, then nodded. All right, we'll hold a meeting with the entire village. If the majority is against it, the idea dies here. Jack still wasn't sure if he could trust that. But one thing was certain. He wasn't going to let his village be swept away by the tide of progress without a fight. The real test was only just beginning. The community hall was filled with tense silence. Everyone waited anxiously for the outcome of the meeting. Jack looked around, feeling the heavy burden of this decision on his shoulders. He had fought to keep Harborview from being swallowed by unchecked development. But now, the village's fate was in the hands of its people. Richard adjusted the microphone, ready to announce the vote. But before he could speak, a noise echoed from outside. The screeching of tires on gravel, followed by the loud slam of a car door. A man in a dark suit, with sharp, calculating eyes, strode into the hall like he owned the place. All eyes turned to him. A chill of suspicion ran down Jack's spine. Something was wrong. "Richard," the man called out, his voice laced with impatience. "Are you seriously going through with this?" Richard turned slowly, his expression hardening. "What are you doing here, Carter?" Jack narrowed his eyes. Who the hell was this guy? Carter walked up to the central table, barely concealing his disdain for the village around him. "I'm here to make sure you don't throw everything away over this sentimentality," he said, crossing his arms. "We've already invested millions in projects along this coast. You know damn well this village is a key asset in our plans. And now you want to let these fishermen decide what happens to our investment?" Jack felt his blood boil. "Our investment?" he repeated, glaring at Richard. "This is part of something bigger, isn't it?" Richard stayed silent for a moment, then closed his eyes and exhaled heavily. "Carter is part of my company. He represents our investors." Jack pushed his chair back and stood up, the legs scraping against the wooden floor. "So this was all a lie? You never actually planned to listen to us?" The room erupted into murmurs. Ethan stood up from the back of the hall, his fists clenched. "I knew it! I told you this guy was just like all the others." Carter stepped forward, locking eyes with Jack. "Let's be honest here. This village could be transformed into something much bigger. Resorts, high-end restaurants, exclusive marinas. Do you really think these people will stand in the way of progress? They don't have a choice." Jack felt anger bubbling inside him. He turned to Richard, waiting for his reaction. But to his surprise, Richard didn't look pleased with Carter's presence. If anything, he looked conflicted. Then Richard did something no one expected. He grabbed the microphone again and turned to face the village. "Carter is right about one thing," he said, his voice steady. "This village is incredibly valuable, but he's wrong about something else." The room fell into absolute silence. "I have a choice," Richard continued, "and I choose Harborview." Carter's eyes widened in disbelief. "What the hell are you saying?" Richard locked eyes with his business partner, his expression dark and resolute. "I'm saying I just ended our contract. My money, my decision. I'm out." The hall erupted in murmurs. Jack could hardly believe what he was hearing. Carter let out a sharp, incredulous laugh. "Are you serious? You're throwing away millions for this forgotten village?" Richard took a deep breath. "I almost died in that ocean, Carter. For the first time in years, I saw life differently. Money can buy a lot of things, but it can't buy respect. It can't buy belonging. And if this village has taught me anything, it's that real progress happens when people grow together, not when they're replaced." Jack felt something shift inside him. For the first time, he saw Richard not just as a businessman, but as a man genuinely fighting to be different. Carter let out another laugh, but this time it was laced with frustration and anger. "You're making the biggest mistake of your life." Richard crossed his arms. "Maybe, but for the first time, I'm sure of it." Carter glanced around, realizing that no one in the room was on his side. With one last look of disdain, he turned on his heels and stormed out, slamming the door behind him. For a moment, the hall was silent. Then, Marianne, the cafe owner, stood up and started clapping. Slowly, others joined in. And soon, the entire hall was filled with applause. Jack smiled, feeling a weight lift from his shoulders. He had won, not alone, but with his village. In the months that followed, the project took a new direction. Small businesses were encouraged, fishing areas were protected, and the villagers had a voice in every decision. And Jack? He never imagined that saving a man from the sea would change not just his life, but the fate of the entire village. And in the end, Richard Sullivan didn't just find a new purpose. He found a home.